Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. The Cultural Consulate of the Embassy of the Islamic Republic of Iran in South Africa welcomes you to a webinar on human rights and the abuse of hegemonic powers. Human rights are moral principles for certain standards of human behavior and are protected by international law. They are fundamental rights to which every person is inherently entitled to and are inherent in every human being. Every country claims to uphold human rights, but who is violating the rights of Palestinians, Yemenis, Syrians, and other oppressed people of the world? Our speakers will address human rights issues from different perspectives. The first speaker is Mr. Nader Talebzadeh, an Iranian film director.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, in the name of God, the compassionate and the merciful. One of the most abused words used today by hegemonic powers is human rights. When we talk about human rights, we hear it every day, we hear it in the media. It's a very sharp, biting accusation used by hegemonic powers against independent and rising sovereign entities in the world. I would like to use Iran as an example because this is what I have experienced in Iran in the past 42 years that I've been working in the media. I've been working with television. I've been working with foreign news outlets. I've experienced almost everything about the Islamic Revolution from the advent until now. And I've witnessed how they use human rights like a weapon, like a tool to demoralize, to demean a rising, independent nation that is trying to get on its feet, like Iran in 1979, when Iran broke the shackles, broke the chains that confined it, chains that the U.S. government had imposed on Iran. The U.S. government had over 50,000 employees, all highly paid by the U.S. government. Iran was America's white horse in the Middle East. Nixon called Iran the white horse, the gendarme of the Persian Gulf. And that's how it was handled. So when the Islamic Revolution happened and when the people rose, one of the first things that they used to attack Iran in the media was, of course, human rights abuse. Iran is the abuser of human rights. And this was the first thing that happened. I remember from the very beginning, I remember CBS News as an example for the audience that's listening right now. I remember CBS News was in Tehran at that time, and they were told to do a story on the fleeing of the Jewish population from Tehran to flee the grand evasion of human rights and how the Jewish minority was going to be persecuted, etc., etc. This was a story that New York wanted the CBS correspondent in Tehran to do. This was about 2 months after the victory of the revolution. And I knew the CBS news anchor, the correspondent, a very well-educated man from Wisconsin. And when he did a story and he finished the story was not only that the Jewish population was not fleeing from Iran, they were doing their business, they're playing in their sports courts and the clubs, and they're living a pretty nice life, and no one was threatening them to leave. So the story was exactly the opposite of what New York wanted from this correspondent. So after 2 weeks of investigating and interviewing people, he finished and edited the piece and sent it to New York, and New York rejected it because it was opposed to what they wanted to say about human rights in Tehran. The correspondent was very sincere. He said, you know, after this mission, I'm going back and I'm getting out of CBS. I'm going back to my hometown. I'm going to start a small radio station. This is a travesty where I realized that an entire media entity prefers to lie, grand lies. So that was my first lesson, where I realized CBS, ABC, NBC were distorting everything about Iran. Two, the second thing I want to give you as an example that happened in Iran at that time, another example of so-called human rights abuse, was when Iran did something that is universally against international law. They took over the United States Embassy in Tehran. Yes, this is against international law. I agree with that. We all know that. And of course, Iran was immediately accused of gross international violation. And this was the first time America was confronted with a country that confronted it all out. And they held these 50 hostages. But in reality, what we're talking about is the same embassy that 25 years back had directed a coup d'etat by the CIA, which had just been formed, against the rights, the human rights of the Iranian nation. They had taken over the government that was freely elected by the parliament and by the people. The American coup d'etat in 1953 by the CIA was directly from the same embassy in Tehran. So now, today, 25 years later, they had taken over that embassy, which was in the habit of conducting coup d'etats, as an example. And at that time, it was later on discovered, almost a year later, there was another coup d'etat being concocted by some old Iranian army members and the US CIA. So when the students took over and the Imam, the late Imam Khomeini, supported that movement, it was actually against another concocted coup d'etat that was creeping into the scene. So which is human rights? Which human rights are we talking about? The human rights of what the American US media says Iran has violated, has taken over an embassy. Who will take care of Iran's rights? Who will stop the American embassy from conducting another devious plan to have a coup d'etat and to cripple the ongoing fledgling government that has just begun? So Iran was driven basically 50 years back in history by that American coup d'etat. So 25 years later, when this happened, it was an actual response, a reaction. And to many, this is human rights. This is upholding a nation's rights to become sovereign and not to be tricked again, to be bitten from the same hole. We'll come to another instance. The third example I want to give today is what's happening today with the JCPOA. Iran is accused of violating human rights in a completely different way. Today, the 5+1, the 6 powers of the world, are accusing Iran of trying to develop an atomic bomb. Therefore, it's the grand sin and the grand abuse of human rights to develop atomic nuclear bombs by a nation that they call a terrorist nation. Therefore, Iran has to be curbed. So they all gather in Europe, 5+1, and the whole premise is based on, we think that you might be building a nuclear bomb. So therefore, we will sanction you economically. We will cripple you economically because we think you might be building a bomb. Who's saying this? 5 nations who are in the 4th stage of building nuclear bombs. France, England, the US. And continuing this condemnation without any remorse, Iran is the dangerous nation, the dangerous rogue nation that is trying to build a bomb to destroy the world, whereas 16 American agencies have declared that Iran has no intention, has no evidence, not shred of evidence, that Iran is developing anything close to a bomb. It doesn't matter. The human rights alarm has been ringing against Iran, and Iran sits on this side of the table in a very defensive position. I hope now that the government is changing, that position will change. We're not the ones who should be accused of evading human rights. You who are the bomb builders, you are who have used the nuclear bomb. The US has already used the nuclear bomb. You should be curbed. But Iran is alone. So what can Iran do, basically? Is to become stronger, to become militarily stronger, because that's the only language the world understands. To have its military prowess, its military might, its creativity in the military, to be able to stand on its feet and no one dare try to abuse it. The 8-year war where America went and stood behind Saddam Hussein, what happened to that? Who accused England or France and the United States of backing up Saddam? Where was the international court where these nations were taken to court? Non-existent. It's human rights according to the hegemonic powers. Human rights as a tool in the hands of hegemonic powers. And this is a very, very unfair state that doesn't seem to be able to continue on this pattern. Now with the modern ways, with the media, with the internet, with the fast, rapid movements of information, it's difficult, it has become more and more difficult to lie. America, who's been accusing Iran of human rights violations, we all saw in the past year how every capital of every state in the US protested against racial violence. And we saw during that time how many Afro-Americans were slaughtered by the police. And this is the new America, that no one can see the other end of the tunnel. This is the America that, as I'm talking, no one knows in the next year at the same time where America will stand. So, but the hypocrisy is what lasts. America talks about democracy, declares democracy, but is really, as we all know, and you in South Africa see it, and we all see it on this side, it's not so much at all democracy, but hypocrisy. So we keep all our eyes open, and we are very aware and a witness to history that the superpowers do not get away. The French do not get away. The British do not get away. The US does not get away. Germany does not get away. It was the Germans who killed the Jews during World War II. Why would the Muslim nations be punished for it? The Muslims didn't touch the Jewish minorities in each of their countries. In my country, they lived the most comfortable life. We didn't even have Jewish jokes here. The Jews lived well in Palestine. The Germans, in collaboration with the French, slaughtered and killed so many of the Jewish population during World War II by Hitler. And then, of course, the Muslim nations are accused. So this human rights tool is something that we should be aware that we should confront, we should stand up. We're happy about what has happened in South Africa. The great Nelson Mandela, the hero of the world for independence, for free mind thinking. The world has really changed. I prefer to talk about the examples that I knew very well and at heart at your well-willed conference, to give you an example of how Iran has withstood this pressure, human rights abuse pressure from the West, successfully, because it is a popular government. This government came to being popularly. There was people demonstrated, people got killed for this government to be formed. So it's not easily toppled. It's like in Cuba. It's not toppled easily because it's by the people, no matter what you try to do. What the U.S. hegemony has to worry about is its own status. Today, America is widely divided between these two groups that clashed on Capitol Hill. And there is where we're going to be watching America's destiny. We saw how the Soviet Union collapsed. We are all watching America's destiny. The big planners of the West are the Americans and their so-called power, where they plan and they make plans for the rest of the world. We'll see and witness what is going to happen to them in a country that is so widely divided that the media does not like to admit to it. And this is something that we all await. We don't know the result, but the hoax, the falsity, the deceit is going to be answered. All these years of deceit are going to be answered. Thank you very much, and God bless you.
Thank you, Mr. Talik Zadeh. Indeed, hegemonic powers do not respect human rights, and the word is abused for all to see. Our next speaker is Dr. Mustafa Mheta, Head of Africa Desk at Media Review Network.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Wassalatu wassalam ala ashraful anbiya'i wal mursalin. Nabiyana Muhammad wa ala alihi wa ashabihi ajma'in. Amma ba'd. My paper is entitled Human Rights as a Weapon to Advance Western Hegemony. In his speech delivered before the General Assembly at the opening of this 73rd session in 2018, French President Emmanuel Macron described many of the challenges before the United Nations and international community. Among them was the cultural, historical, and religious relativism that calls into question the rights enshrined in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights proclaimed global recognition of fundamental human rights principles and standards 70 years ago, further strengthened by the Vienna World Conference almost 50 years later, and declared these rights to be universal, indivisible, interdependent, and interrelated. Despite this history, as President Macron highlighted, a worrying trend in which the universality of human rights is being increasingly challenged can be observed globally. Critics of the notion that human rights are universal often assert that these rights are expressive of Western values, mores, and norms. The debate often hinges on the idea that though human rights are said to have universal validity, they originated in the West, reflect Western interests, and are therefore weapons, therefore a weapon of cultural hegemony or a new form of imperialism. Similarly, others argue that human rights emanate from a European Judeo-Christian or Enlightenment heritage, typically labeled Western, and cannot be enjoyed by other cultures that don't emulate the conditions and values of Western societies. Related to these are the challenges rooted in cultural relativism, that is, that what Western civilization consider universal norms in human rights may not be applicable to other cultures. The premise of the Asian values debate, for example, argues that the civil, political, social, and cultural norms advanced by the international human rights legal framework are Western, rather than universal, and therefore no more legitimate than alternative norms or standards that could be considered Asian or other. By the same token, the increasing use of exceptionalism, claims rooted in religious assertions, as in the case of Islamic human rights or traditional values debates, have become more commonplace. What these narratives offered by critics deny is the pivotal struggle and experiences that gave rise to myriad international human rights instruments and mechanisms invoked across the globe today. All cultures, Western or otherwise, are acquainted with the experience of injustice, which beget demands for the recognition of human rights from oppressed populations that later gave rise to human rights reforms. It is this collective experience with injustice which constitutes an authoritative foundation on which to build a theory of rights. Moreover, debates focused on the origins of human rights or claims to historical or anthropological universality often obscure the fact that modern conceptualizations and articulations of human rights norms and standards were formed as political responses to the atrocities of the last World War. The international expressions of rights themselves claim no philosophical foundation, do not reflect any clear philosophical assumption, and articulate no particular moral principles or any single comprehensive theory of the relation of the individual to society. They are the outcome of diplomatic initiatives involving political strategy and negotiated agreements. The claims of non-universality also fall flat when looking back at historical support for human rights. 58 countries assembled in 1948 to affirm their faith in the dignity and worthy of all persons. In the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, wherein a framework for preserving that dignity and fostering respect for its worth was offered. Among these states were African, Asian, and Latin American countries. 37 states were associated with the Judeo-Christian traditions, 11 Islamic, 6 Marxist, and 4 identified as being associated with Buddhist, Confucian traditions. It was Egyptian delegate Umar Lutfi who proposed that the Universal Declaration of Human Rights referenced the universality of human rights, noting that such rights should be applicable to nations and peoples that were not autonomous, meaning those persons still subject to colonial rule at the time, while social and economic rights were placed on the agenda as a result of pushes from the Arab states and the Soviet bloc, respectively. 48 countries voted in favor, with 8 abstention, and the other 2 countries not voting. Among the abstainers were Saudi Arabia, the Soviet bloc, which demanded more emphasis on social economic rights than referenced in the document, and South Africa, whose government was openly hostile to the declaration. As such, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was formed with major influence from non-Western states, thereby giving it legitimacy as a truly universally applicable charter to guide humanity's pursuit of peace and security. In preceding years, Latin American and African countries, in addition to several European states, championed these rights through the establishment of initiatives and procedures for scrutinizing and reporting on human rights conditions and for advancing wide acceptance of human rights among diverse cultures, all of which ultimately led to the present-day UN Human Rights Council and its special procedures. By the mid-1960s, the number of countries participating in the process of constructing these standards had more than doubled. The presence of newly decolonized countries within the UN put self-determination, anti-discrimination rights, and later the right to development on the agenda. When the two covenants on civil and political rights and on economic, social, and cultural rights were forwarded to the UN General Assembly for final approval in 1966, there was no opposition of any kind. Both covenants were approved by unanimous votes of the General Assembly, which consisted of 100 members at that time. Furthermore, states like Chile, Jamaica, Argentina, Ghana, and the Philippines and others were vanguards for the advancement of concepts such as protecting, in addition to promoting human rights. In 1963, for example, 14 non-Western UN member states requested that the General Assembly include a discussion on the violations of human rights in South Vietnam on its agenda, alleging that the Diem regime had been perpetuating violations of rights of Vietnamese Buddhists in the country. The appeal resulted in the first iteration of a special procedure led by the chair of the Commission of Human Rights. Similarly, in 1967, a cross-regional group of states from Africa, Asia, the Middle East, and the Caribbean secured the adoption of two Commission resolutions, establishing the first two special procedure mandates: the ad hoc working group of experts on Southern Africa and the special rapporteur on apartheid. The special procedures mechanism was thus established. Both resolutions were adopted by a vote, with most Western countries abstaining. As noted by some experts, there is actual wide acceptance that global standards are necessary for domestic political institutions, and that actual or threatened violations of these standards are reasonable grounds for action from the outside. This is a point in history without precedent, and one which needs to be safeguarded. Civil society actors operating across the world depend on such international standards to anchor their claims for justice, but they often appear unaware of the degree to which their states were invested in the negotiations that created those standards. There is a richer, more complex story in need of recognition. This story must make clear the participation of Global South states in advancing recognition of human rights norms and their leadership in establishing the accompanying international bodies and procedures for better realizing them. We also cannot ignore the contribution of human rights groups across the globe today that continue to fill the gaps in the international human rights framework. This story is deserving of recognition in the halls of the UN and in parliaments around the world for the human dignity of all persons. Wa akhiru dawana anil hamdulillah.
Thank you, Dr. Mehta. It is undeniably evident that Western powers use human rights as a weapon to advance their domination. I now welcome Dr. Mohsin Pakain, a former ambassador to Zambia, Thailand, Uzbekistan, and Azerbaijan.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. First of all, I would like to thank our cultural counselor to invite me here to be among you and discuss regarding the violation of the human rights by the United States and some European countries. For years, Western countries, especially the United States, have been accusing some countries, and the Islamic Republic of Iran in particular, of human rights violations by waging psychological warfare against the Iranian people. But the reality is that the United States and some European countries are among the main human rights abusers, and the worst part crimes in its colonies, especially in Africa, and their current support for Israel regime in the massacre of the Palestinians and complicity with the Saudi Arabia rulers in the massacre in Yemen is a clear manifestation of the violation of the human rights. Ayatollah Khamenei, the leader of the Islamic Revolution, has designated July 7 to 12 as American Human Rights Week and has called for the opportunity to be used to disclosure and condemn human rights violation by the United States. The initiative of the leader of revolution in naming the American Human Rights Week has a very important message, and in fact exposing the ugly face of United States has become a strategic matter and has become one of the duties of human-loving countries. One of the most obvious examples of human rights abuses by the United States, which according to the Iran leader, the United Nations should also condemn, is the burning of the Davidic Center during the Clinton presidency. At that time, the U.S. military brutally attacked members of Christian group who had gathered in a house, and dozens of women, men, and children were burned alive in the blaze. The crimes of American officers and soldiers in Afghanistan's Bagram prison are hateful after the occupation. In this prison, American soldiers cut off the fingers of their victims and used them as game pieces. They used the severed heads of innocent Afghans as soccer balls and enjoyed the sexual harassment of prisoners in front of their families. Similar crimes took place many times in Abu Ghraib prison in Iraq. The Guantanamo Bay massacre, which is another manifestation of human rights abuses, is not hidden from anyone, and its images are available on the internet. The racist and inhuman treatment of people of color by the U.S. policy and military, which began in the assassination of George Floyd, is undoubtedly in violation of human rights. Today, Americans of color, the main victims of American human rights, are against the unjust structure of the United States in their struggles and are determined to change that structure to continue the struggle. The creation of terrorist groups such as ISIS and Al-Nusra and giving them a mission for the U.S. proxy war against Syria and Iraq is also on the U.S. human rights record. Unfortunately, all these crimes are being committed in front of the eyes of the United Nations and the head of the Commissioner for Human Rights, Mrs. Bachelet. Every fair and just person looking at the available statistics and information concludes that no government in the world has violated human rights as much as the United States. And unfortunately, the countries that hold the flag of human rights protection were and are the main violator of human rights. American Human Rights Week is a symbol for exposing the West and American crimes, and the activities of relevant institutions should not take place only during this week. The fact is that given the crimes committed by the United States in different parts of the world, every day can be considered a day of human rights violations by the United States. Thank you, and all the best to you.
Thank you, Dr. Pakain. Every day should be a day to highlight human rights abuses. Please welcome Professor Adam Sibyala, a lecturer and a media activist in Uganda.
Let me talk about human rights. It means standards set to safeguard human life, the basic freedoms, and human dignity. In anthropology, the Quran itself mentions that man was created dignified, is a dignified species. وَلَقَدْ كَرَّمْنَا بَنِي آدَمَ. And we see Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam in his life preaching the observance of human rights. He preached it, he practiced it, because the Prophet never preached what he didn't practice. He never compelled the people into Islam and so many other things, freedom of ownership and so on, of education, all these things. Prophet Muhammad lived a complete moral life, and that is the way even the Imams did. The Prophet Muhammad's government practiced all that. It's only that the Imams did not have the chance to be in government. But we are seeing how Imam Ali, for that brief period, guaranteed human rights and also practiced it, giving the oppressed all their rights. Let me look at the Western world that claims to champion democracy, human observance of human rights, and so on. These countries, especially the United States and Britain, have the moral right to preach to us, to lecture to us the observance of human rights? I doubt. Why? Because these are countries that were founded by immigrants. These immigrants who, from their countries, found the natives, Red Indians, in the United States, Aborigines in Australia, and exterminated them. The Americans exterminated the Red Indians, and today they are not more than 2%. This is people, the natives, who were exterminated, a kind of genocide. And genocide is the worst crime against humanity. They have never apologized, they have never repented to those who were aggrieved. Those have no moral right to preach to us when they committed crimes against humanity to the degree of genocide. The same did by Britain in Australia when they exterminated the Aborigines. Those are the natives. They are not more than 3%. They never learned to live with others, which violates equality. Because people should be equal in services and before the law. And they shouldn't kill them because the Human Rights Charter guarantees freedom to life. So they cannot preach to us. That is why in the Middle East, in our countries, they are allies with the dictators. These people who have never been elected by their populations. Their governments are allies with the United States. Why? Because it is these puppet regimes in those countries that help them to exploit the resources of the country. So long as they are robbing from the country, then they will not sing to these rulers observance of human rights. They are even protecting them. I saw one of the Western leaders protecting the government which slaughtered its citizen in an embassy. I saw one of the leaders defending them.
Your contribution is appreciated, Prof. Sibyala. Human rights should be respected irrespective of one's nationality, race, or tribe. Our next speaker is Dr. Daoud Ameri, Secretary General of the Islamic World Peace Forum.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحیم. تلاش برای کرامت انسانی، برقراری عدالت و حقوق انسان‌ها کار مقدس و بشردوستانه است که فعالین این حوزه رو باید ستود. از این رو وظیفه خود میدونم تشکر بکنم از رایزنی فرهنگی جمهوری اسلامی ایران در آفریقای جنوبی، برادر ارجمندم آقای دکتر محسن زاده و همه کسانی که کمک کردند تا این وبینار ارزشمند برگزار شد. اهداف بشردوستانه شما رو باید ستود، ارج نهاد و تلاش کرد که این گونه اقدامات در سطح جامعه بشری تسری پیدا بکنه. مایلم در این فرصت ارزشمند دو نکته رو عرض بکنم. نکته اول، دیدگاه اسلام و جمهوری اسلامی به این مفاهیم ارزشمنده. اسلام طرفدار صلح و حقوق بشر است، صلح و حقوق بشر حقیقی، اما بر چند نکته نیز تأکید داره. ابتدا عدالت باید در همه شؤون مدخلیت داشته باشه. دوم، رعایت کرامت انسانی در کنار رعایت حقوق انسان‌ها و در مرحله آخر توجه به اجرای بیانیه حقوق بشر با نگاه به تنوع فرهنگ‌ها و ملت‌ها. لذا ما اعتقاد داریم با نگاه به این چند ملاحظه می‌توانیم حقوق انسان‌ها رو بهتر در دنیا رعایت کنیم. این نگاهی فاخرتر و بالاتر به حقوق و کرامت انسان‌ها در جهان کنونی نیست. اما نکته دوم چند سواله. همه می‌دانیم بیانیه حقوق بشر بیانیه است مورد قبول همه ملت‌ها. بیانیه حقوق بشر یک قانون و منشور جهانی است. اما چرا بعضی از دولت‌ها به اون توجه نمی‌کنند، به اون عمل نمی‌کنند؟ چرا بسیاری از کشورها خود رو استثناء قرار میدن و ضمن اینکه مدعی حقوق بشر در دنیا هستن، ما شاهد اون هستیم که در کشورهاشون نقض حقوق انسان‌ها بسیار اتفاق میفته، مثل کشور امریکا، کانادا و بعضی کشورهایی که امروز نقش مدعی رو برای حقوق بشر در دنیا بازی میکنن و تلاش میکنن علیه ملت‌های دیگه بیانیه بدن و تلاش کنن پرونده سازی برای حقوق بشر بکنن. به نظر میرسه که بعضی از کشورهای صاحب قدرت تا اونجایی به حقوق بشر توجه دارن که منافع ملی اونها یا منافع اونها به خطر نیفتاده باشه. ما امروز حقوق بشر و حقوق انسانها را به هر قیمتی باید بخواهیم و به اون توجه بکنیم. من از این فرصت استفاده میخوام بکنم و چند درخواست داشته باشم. من میخواهم که این کشورها حق رو بپذیرن، به حق بازگردن، به عدالت، به صلح و حقوق بشر پایبند باشن. اونها به این پیام‌ها و ارزش‌های الهی رجوع کنن، اهتمام کنن، البته به صورت واقعی. دوم، از نخبگان جهان تقاضا دارم تا به نقش و وظیفه خودشون در این زمینه توجه ویژه بکنن. اونها در تبیین و ترویج این مفاهیم ارزشمند الهی و بشردوستانه میتوانند نقش جدی رو ایفا بکنند. امروز نخبگان سردمداران و روشنفکران جهان کنونی هستند. در کنار این سازمان‌های مردم نهاد جهان که امروز نقش کلیدی در قدرت سازی‌های مدنی در جهان دارند، اونها با مطالبه‌گری و برگزاری جلسات اندیشه‌ای و بصیرتی می‌توانند به عنوان مطالبه‌گران واقعی این حقوق الهی و انسانی عمل بکنند. در کنار این خاضعانه از رهبران ادیان الهی میخواهم که به این مفاهیم بلند که در همه ادیان به آنها توجه شده اهتمام کنند. مطالبه‌گر صلح، عدالت و کرامت انسانی در جهان کنونی باشند. امروز جهان از همه شماها انتظار دارد تا کمکشون کنید در مسیر یک زندگی سعادت بخش. پس ما همه وظیفه داریم تلاش بکنیم تا انسان بتواند به آینده با امید بهتر نگاه کنه و سعادت رو در آینده ببینه. در پایان تشکر میکنم مجدد از همه کسانی که کوشش کردند تا این وبینار برگزار بشه. شما رو به خدا می‌سپارم.
Thank you, Dr. Ameri. Your advice is appreciated. Indeed, human rights activists should be praised. Our next speaker is Sheikh Ali Masaoudi, a PhD candidate at the University of Johannesburg and a lecturer at Al-Mustafa International University.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. I greet you, respected listeners. I am going to be talking about the use and abuse of human rights discourse. Generally speaking, the concept of human right is so important. When we look into the Quran, we will find a verse like Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. وَلَقَدْ كَرَّمْنَا بَنِي آدَمَ. We have indeed honored and dignified the children of Adam. When we summarize this verse, we will find a whole lot about human dignity, human honor, and human right in general. Analyzing the concept of human right in our time, we find that largely a human right has largely been reduced to language. And language itself is a source of power, particularly in the arena of politics. According to Aristotle, people are political animals. And ever since Aristotle said this, questions have been asked about the ways in which language and politics are connected. The language of human right has become increasingly important both in academic and political decision making. The nature of human right is curious. The notion enjoys support from various groups across our globe. All are speaking about human right, particularly if you go to the oppressed societies and countries. Yet, the notion of human rights is also the object of suspicion. This is largely due to concerns about Western power, especially in societies that were ruled by colonial powers in the West. Despite human rights traditions and discussions originated in the West and been based on Western values and thinking. It claims universality. In our time, acting in compliance with universal human rights has gradually become the standard by which states are measured, and accusing a state of acting in non-compliance has become a way to challenge state sovereignty through intervention. Thus, it has become a commonplace strategy to appeal to human rights in order to legitimize the case for political change. It is very interesting. People speak about human rights, promote the concept of human right, but they themselves violate the right of humanity. In other words, the whole idea of human right is not promoted because the promoter care about human right or human dignity. It is a rhetoric used to further violate human right. Increasingly, this strategy is also used by government seeking to justify their interference in the domestic affairs of other states. Human rights cannot realistically be said to exist only to protect the weak from abuse, as they are increasingly politicized and co-opted as an instrument through which the politics of power is advanced. Despite human rights becoming increasingly widespread and popular in our world, the omnipresence of human rights rhetoric discussions has not been matched by clarity, and the meaning of the language of human rights has become confused and contested. People speak about human rights. On the other hand, they are seen violating the right of people. We have seen how the so-called war on terror destabilized and robbed people, particularly in some part of Middle East and in some part of Africa, of their dignity and honor. Quran reminds us by saying, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, لِمَ تَقُولُونَ مَا لَا تَفْعَلُونَ. Why do you preach that which you do not practice? People will sing the song of human right. On the other hand, they are guilty of violating human right. كَبُرَ مَقْتًا إِنَّ اللَّهَ أَن تَقُولُوا مَا لَا تَفْعَلُونَ. It's actually a grave sin to preach that which you do not practice. We are in the days of human rights. It is incumbent upon us to discuss human rights from all angles. I thought it is important to raise this question, expose this point for us to understand the question of human rights better. I thank you. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi ta'ala wa barakatuh.
Thank you, Sheikh Ali, for your insightful contribution. People will sing songs of human rights and violate the same rights. I now welcome Dr. Javad Mohammadi, a diplomat in the medical field.
In the name of Allah, most gracious, most merciful, ladies and gentlemen, hello and good days. First of all, I would mention a brief history of the United States. The United States government is based on organized racial discrimination. European immigrants first laid the foundation stone of American civilization by killing the natives of the Americas and stealing them from their homeland. and then by choosing the system of slavery, evolved the civilization by exploiting black slaves. For all his praise of Lincoln, he was never opposed to racial discrimination, and based on political compromise, he advocated the abolition of slavery while preserving racial discrimination. The institutionalized American confrontation with black race still indicates that the treatment of black has not changed until a century and a half after the declaration of the liberation of slaves. Thus, people of color are still second-class citizens and the lower classes of American society. In recent century, Americans kill people and show themselves with obvious crime and do not apologize. At the same time, they say human rights. The governments of the United States and the West, with their human, civil, and moral appearance, commit the worst crimes, and are constantly violating human rights. The American human rights claim is a big lie. Actually, is a big lie. What does American human rights mean? A 5-year-old child is handcuffed, 80 people are imprisoned in one place for dissent, and men, women, and children are burned and killed, and then claim human rights. Every few days on the streets of American cities, an innocent man, an unarmed man, is beaten to death by the American police. This is human rights? Human values have been trampled on in America. They legalized torture, discrimination, difference, racism is institutionalized there. The United States has become the flagship of human rights. What happened in Abu Ghraib, Guantanamo, Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, Yemen, Palestine, Hiroshima, and other parts of the world by the Americans, the Zionist regime, and the United Kingdom? Is these human rights? These are examples of American human rights claim. What country has established and supported ISIS to commit so many crimes? The answer is easy: the United States. In addition to the thousands of crimes, recent Zionist regime's attack on Gaza killed more than 60 children. In Yemen, hundreds of children are killed by American weapons at the hands of Saudi forces. And Western countries and the United States support these criminals and do nothing against Israel and Saudi Arabia. The President of the United States declares the condemnation of Saudi Arabia against the interests of the United States. This reaction of the United States President can be clearly seen in the brutal murder of Khashoggi by Saudi Arabia. And international human rights organizations take no practical action other than issuing a statement. UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres removes Saudi-led military coalition from Yemen's blacklist of child rights violations. In 2016, the name of Saudi coalition was briefly added to the list and then removed by former US Secretary General Ban Ki-moon. Of course, Riyadh has threatened to reduce part of its quota to the United Nations. This is the situation of international organization. They readily close their eyes to the killing of innocent people and to remain silent in the face of crime in order to get money. The United States have imposed drug sanctions on Iranian people and they persist this sanction. The sanction was well seen in the sale of the coronavirus vaccine. Because of the human rights violations by Americans, we claim, we question them. We will face them in the court of public opinion in the world and they have no answer. Yes, the US government is the biggest human rights violators in the world. On the other hand, the main weakness of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is the exaggeration of individual rights and the neglect of the rights of God Almighty and the rights of society. We believe that the source of all rights is God's rights and that individual and social rights are respected as long as they do not conflict with God's right. In addition, the declaration of some major and fundamental shortcomings such as lack of logical order, disregard for religion, lack of theoretical basis, incoherence and transparency, etc. has it. The result of these weaknesses is the current situation in the arrogant countries. Yes, the result of these weaknesses is the current situation in the arrogant countries. The countries that are creators and signatories of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights have themselves become its biggest violators. The people are shooting themselves and the people are boycotting other free countries. Many scientists consider human dignity is basis. Many scientists consider human dignity as its basis, but some do not accept it. Some define it based on need. What is need? Material matters or based on interests? Some says, what is the role of human rights in politics? Accordingly, some governments allow themselves to impose sanctions on other countries and violate the rights of millions of people. We can't list all the dimensions of human rights in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and only select some of them and defend them, says James Griffin. This is the theory against the human rights movement in the world. That is, we treat human rights selectively. No, this is wrong. We must accept all aspects of human rights. He says we should find philosophical support for human rights. However, we should focus on basic rights rather than everything in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Human rights must be based on human dignity. If angels prostrate to man, It's based on human dignity. The other point that I would make is that if the human being have any rights at all, it's something for which we should be grateful to God. Man's dignity is due to God's grace to man. We deserve them as human beings, but because God has guided us to respect the rights for others. Based on this, behavior with other human being is defined, preserving the dignity of human being in the world is the result of worship. This is a fundamental basis for human rights. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Thank you, Dr. Muhammadi. Human rights are for all human beings. From Tanzania, I welcome Dr. Buberwa Kaiza, a political analyst.
Thank you. My name is Buberwa Kaiza. I'm an international consultant on global issues, projects including human rights and extractive industries. Let me very quickly comment on this very important subject matter, the human rights and the abuse of hegemonic powers. We know that since the year 1948, when the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was published, the whole world switched on the promotion of human rights at international level, and also human rights has constituted the diplomatic relations, the way of living, and also one of the key agenda in diplomatic relations, but also in the United Nations. Again, the sub-regional intergovernmental organizations, for example, the African Union, the European Union, and others have found themselves also addressing the issue of human rights. And we know we have the protocol, the UN level, which include the civilian and political rights. Also, we have the different sub-regional intergovernmental organizations have established the means and the institutional arrangement, and also setting the regulations and also the protocol for promoting human rights, and to ensure that the global security, global peace and security also is consistent with promoting human rights. And it has been growing, of course, at different levels and also different generations. But this time around, I'm discussing this with a focus on the extent to which hegemonic powers have been the cause of abuse of human rights itself, abusing the international concord, the international agreements, the existing, even the existing international protocol on human rights, especially when you have hegemonic powers using existing institutions like the UN Security Council, which should be would be expected to promote human rights at global level, but the hegemonic powers are using this as the way of avoiding or bypassing the requirement to promote and safeguard human rights globally. For example, we have witnessed the wars in Yemen, For over 10 years now, Yemen has been under serious human rights violations, and there is the actors like the U.S., the United States government, supporting the Saudi Arabia government to launch wars that has made serious violation of human rights in Yemen. But much as U.S. the hegemonic power, much as Saudi is supported by U.S. and you see the violation of human rights have continued unabated because of the hegemonic powers. But again, we have witnessed a lot of much graver human rights violation, for example, in Afghanistan and also in Iraq. And we have all seen all this taking place with the support of hegemonic power, like the U.S. matches the interest of hegemonic power. They are in jeopardy. They want to defend their interests. They want to safeguard their interests. They have taken the human rights of the other countries in which they want to assess their interests, to maintain their interests. These countries have taken as collateral damages to the U.S. because of the hegemonic power, of the interest of the strategic interest of the United States. But again, we saw very recently, 3 or 4 years ago, when the United States government and the administration of Donald Trump decided to withdraw from the global compact on Iran nuclear development. The agreement that was agreed by European Union countries together with the US and the other global powers. That was agreed to allow Iran to develop the nuclear power for development use, non-military uses. But unfortunately, the US unilaterally decided to withdraw, and which had really jeopardized the interests of other members of the global community. But much as that is it was seen by the Trump administration as a core interest of their hegemonic power, their strategic interest, then things were to be like that. Now we see the reversal, and which the international diplomatic negotiations have started to restate the original agreement. So we see that it has been a common phenomenon in the global community, where there is a hegemonic interest, where you have the U.S. interest involved, strategic interest, where you have the Chinese as well, where the Chinese interests are involved. We have seen, for example, again, is for Chinese, they very much regularly or recently violated the human rights in Hong Kong, but again also they are threatening the Taiwan administration to take over it, and I don't press they will succeed. But that is against the will of the people of Taiwan, is against the will of the people of Hong Kong. But much as it is one of the superpowers, a member of the United Nations Security Council, it is like whatever they want to do, the human rights may come second. It doesn't come first as the core interest of the people, but the hegemonic powers has always been taken as upfront as their material needs. Much as their material needs are leopard, they want to ensure that they succeed in achieving their material interest. They succeed in achieving their strategic interest, and they mind not about the rights of the people, on the contrary to existing protocols and the directive and regulations under the UN Security Council, under the UN Human Rights Commission, and the protocol for human rights and political and economic rights of the people. So this has been the trend, and quite unfortunately, the way they stand unipolar, the voice that is opposing to these hegemonic tendencies has tended to be ignored. The global media, international media, they've tended to promote the status quo, the voice of the power, and ignoring the voice of the voiceless, the people whose rights are maimed, disregarded, are violated. So one has to think of perhaps setting or looking for another global economic and social order where human rights will be once again taken a central agenda and also safeguarded, and in which also the hegemonic strategic interest will no longer be taken as primary over and above the interest of the people, of the nations, where people, as I said, and we have known witnessed, especially in many countries of the South. We see a lot of violations in the many countries of the South, violation of human rights, much as there is interest of the hegemonic powers. And only when it comes that hegemonic powers' interests are not involved is when you hear international media also drumbeating against violation of human rights, much as there is no interest for them to defend. There are many examples, like you see, we have seen it, for example, in the country like the South, like Zimbabwe. Zimbabwe has, since 2000, passed through grievous violation of human rights, and the hegemonic powers they came out very strongly against the regime in Harare, not because the people of Harare were being violated their rights by the regime, but more because the interest of the UK, the US, and the others, hegemonic powers were at stake. So they will come always, the hegemonic powers will always come out to shine out, to condemn the violation of human rights of a regime, much as that regime is also jeopardizing the interest of the hegemonic powers. So we need to set a standard globally and a concord, but also to see a mechanism that is as a balance in which we can be sure that no hegemonic powers' interest is defended at the expense of the poor countries but should be like the UN Security Council, the UN Human Rights Commission, the relevant organs and institutions within the European Union, as well as the African Union, and the others that are safeguarding and promoting human rights should do this in disregard of the status of the economic and the military power of a particular state, but it should focus on the real rights of the people of the country, ensure people are not denied of their right to food, are not denied of their right to information, are not denied of their right to medical care, medical services, are not denied of their, their rights of access to democracy and good governance. So these should be considered as core and the part and parcel of the regulatory mechanism to ensure people benefits and access rights, not because the superpower, the hegemonic powers, they want ABC to happen, but because the people in the world, through the governing institutions, I said, are there to benefit from the existing relations and the protocols for supporting and promoting human rights and also enhancing the well-being of the human being. My name is Buberwa Kaiser.
Much appreciated. Thank you, Dr. Kaiser. Our last speaker is Mr. George Nyongeza, a lecturer and PhD candidate from the University of Nairobi in Kenya.
Greetings, assalamu alaikum, good morning or good evening from wherever you'll be watching this video from. My name is George Nyongeza. I'm speaking to you from Nairobi, Kenya. I am a PhD student at the University of Nairobi. I also consult for the government of Kenya on different policy matters. I'm also a member and an activist in the civil society organization called Concerned Citizen Kenya. The topic of today is of my interest because especially of my activism. We are here together today in the symposium on human rights under abuse of hegemonic powers organized by the Consulate of the Embassy of Islamic Republic of Iran in South Africa. This topic is very important for us around the world because hegemony is an idea that is so pervasive, so found everywhere, but yet most people do not understand this concept or this idea. Therefore, just to start, I want to thank the organizers of this symposium and also thank my fellow speakers who will be bringing out the importance of the idea of hegemonic power and also try to demonstrate the dangers of abuse of hegemonic power. This topic on human rights under the abuse of hegemonic power demands that we first of all grapple with trying to understand the meaning of hegemony and its related concepts such as dominance and the idea of hegemonic power. Once we understand these concepts, then it should help us to be able to understand how the abuse of hegemonic power is important to the good of why it's important for the understanding, why is it important to understand the idea of hegemonic power, especially in relation to abuse, and how this is good for the united and inclusive international family. We want now to look at the idea of hegemony as simply being use of force plus legitimization mechanism. Thank you very much, and God bless all of us.
Thank you, Mr. Nyongeza, and thank you to all our speakers. Your presentations are a contribution towards advocating human rights for all human beings. Remember, every human being is entitled to human rights by virtue of being human. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.